Thomas Pogge for participating with us again. Thank you to the Macmillan Center for working with us again on these issues. I want to go further in thanking Tom Cardamone. Tom is responsible for the bookends of where we find ourselves in this agenda at the present time. Norway held 3 conferences in 2007 and 2008 that brought together people from the community interested in financial transparency issues. And out of those conferences came what we called the Oslo Matrix, which was a grouping of 50 points concerning how you address this matter of the need for greater financial transparency. Tom took those 50 points and boiled them down to 5 that encompassed basically what we were talking about. And Tom, I've never forgotten how effective you were in pulling those 5 points together. Now, having done so, Tom was also the first to realize 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, 5 or 6 months ago, when we were planning this conference, that we've succeeded in getting those 5 points on the global agenda. We don't need to go back and talk about, well, what does this mean? What does automatic exchange of tax information mean? What does country-by-country reporting mean? We've had 4 conferences in which we've addressed that, and we've talked about it all over the world. We've been there and done that. What we need to do now is to talk about where we take these issues. But I give Tom credit for having been the first person to recognize that, we've gotten our issues out there. The G20 has adopted what we were talking about. The OECD is very much into what we're talking about. Financial Action Task Force and others. So the issue is on the global agenda. The ways of achieving greater transparency in the global financial system, for the multitude of reasons that we're working on this, for human rights, which is part of this conference, for economic development, for economic justice. The ways that you work on this are pretty straightforward. Automatic exchange of tax information, which Tom has talked about. Country-by-country reporting, where multinational corporations will report on what they're doing in each country where they are in business. Third, beneficial ownership, which means knowledge of who are the natural persons owning accounts. Harmonization of anti-money laundering policies around the world, that's needed. The United States is still open to some forms of illegally generated money coming from abroad being deposited in the United States. We need to harmonize anti-money laundering laws. And then fifth, we need to curtail trade mispricing through greater transparency in the pricing reporting. Overarching some of these issues is the question of tax havens and how do we curtail tax havens. None of this is rocket science, none of it is new, and none of it is technically difficult to accomplish. At this point, I want to read a quote from Emmeline Pankhurst, who was a leader in the British suffragist movement, the suffrage movement, in 1913. 100 years ago, Emmeline Pankhurst came to the United States and made a speech in which among her first words were the following: "I do not come here as an advocate, because whatever position the suffrage movement may occupy, it has passed beyond the realm of advocacy, and it has now entered into the sphere of practical politics." It has moved past the realm of advocacy, and it has moved into the sphere of practical politics. I think that's where the transparency issue is at the present time. We've moved past the realm of, we've moved past much of the realm of advocacy, and we have now moved this issue into the sphere of practical politics. So the question, in my view, is how do we secure transparency measures more solidly into practical politics, more solidly into legislation that is adopted by countries? Do we wage separate battles on each issue with each organization that is focusing on those issues? Do we work with the OECD on tax issues, and we work with Financial Action Task Force on money laundering issues? We work with UN on other issues? Or is there a way that the transparency agenda can be pursued through a more holistic effort? Norway is taking the lead on consideration of a convention on transparency. The idea is that individual nations would sign on to a convention pledging transparency in their financial dealings. In other words, my country signing on to the Convention on Transparency will require knowledge of beneficial ownership of accounts so that your country's citizens cannot have disguised entities in my country. My country will share information with you on tax questions, on access to financial data, and so on. My country will close loopholes in anti-money laundering policy so that your citizens can't abuse my country's laws in shifting money across borders. My country will require multinational corporations to report on a jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction basis as to what they are doing so that you know what's going on in your country. My country will constrain the ability of tax havens to move money out of your country into my accounts. The idea of a convention on transparency has been put forward by Norway. Last Friday, a week ago today, I joined the Norwegian Minister of International Development, Heikki Holmås, at a World Bank luncheon which he was hosting, and we had ministers and representatives there from France, Nigeria, Mexico, the Netherlands, South Africa, Finland, and other countries to discuss this idea of a convention on transparency, or the larger issue, how do we advance the transparency agenda? Through the course of our discussions, two questions were raised. First, your individual countries were involved 10 and 12 years ago with a discussion about the whole of government approach. What this means is that all parts of government should be unified in the directions in which they're going, not just one department working in one direction and another department working in another direction. Part of the driver for this, by no means all of it, but part of the driver for this was the contradiction between handing out foreign aid with one hand and taking back illicit money from other countries with the other hand. So there was this, within governments, this attempt to come up with a whole of government approach. The question was asked, is there any difference between those discussions that were held within your countries 10 and 12 years ago and the discussion that is beginning to take place now globally concerning very much the same issues? How do we reconcile policies globally that are contradictory to each other? Is there essentially any difference between the whole of government discussions that you had internally 10 and 12 years ago and the kinds of global discussions that are beginning to take place now? Second question that generated some conversation was participants were asked if our current responses to the transparency agenda were appropriate to the magnitude of the problem. Global Financial Integrity has recently produced a report together with the African Development Bank in which we demonstrated that for Africa, there is a net transfer of money out of Africa to the richer world. Africa is a net creditor, a net transferor to the rest of the world. This is contrary to what we normally think. We think, no, Africa is the recipient of a great deal of foreign aid and foreign direct investment and remittances coming in. We demonstrated in that study that Africa is the opposite, is a net transferor to the rest of the world. We are currently working on another project with the Norwegian Research Council and with 3 Southern institutes in which we think, based on our preliminary data, that we will be able to make the same case for the whole of the developing world. That the whole of the developing world, taking everything into consideration, money going in, money going out, legal and illegal, the whole of the developing world is a net transferor to the rest of the world. This is a rather shocking realization that what we've been thinking of ourselves for years, that we are generous in giving so much money and assistance and aid and so forth to the developing world. In fact, we think within a year or so we may be able to demonstrate that the opposite is the case. So the question arises, is our piecemeal approach to transparency, to the questions of generating greater financial transparency, working on individual issues through individual organizations, is that appropriate to the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with? Both of those questions remained unanswered in that luncheon and will be the subject of a lot more conversation. This conference today and tomorrow and Sunday is extremely important because we look to this conference to help us answer the questions of what is the way forward with this agenda. We've gotten our issues on the table. Now what? Do we work with individual organizations? Do we take a more holistic approach? What is the right way to advance our agenda into broader areas, not just economic development, but also human rights? How do we advance our agenda moving forward? With your insights, I think you can help us determine the answer to that question. What is the most effective way forward to secure what we're talking about more firmly into legislation, into practical politics, into being a reality affecting the world? Thank you.